Hello and welcome to this International Manifesto Group webinar. I'm Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, which was set up in 2020 to discuss the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of the world order and its national and regional components. We are an international group, and you can read and sign our manifesto at www.internationalmanifesto.org. Today's webinar, which is co-sponsored by the Valdai Club and Orinoco Tribune, is entitled Russia's Radical Foreign Policy Reorientation, an interview with Professor Sergei Karaganov. Indeed, this is our first interview-based webinar. So welcome, Professor Karaganov.
Yeah, good evening.
Thank you.
It's evening here.
Great. So let me just give a bit of background to this. As you probably are all aware, the world has witnessed over the past 2 years, but also over the past decade, a radical reorientation of Russia's foreign policy. As one after another, the doors to the West, originally opened wide by Peter the Great, have clanged shut, and Russia has increasingly started looking eastward, away from the West and Europe, and towards a Eurasian future. Our interview guest today can be said to be in the eye of this storm of transformation, and we are very privileged to have him here. And with me to interview Professor Karaganov are two colleagues, Professors Oleg Barabanov and Professor Richard Sakwa. So let us first introduce everyone. So I will now ask Professor Richard Sakwa to introduce Professor Karaganov.
Thank you for that, and welcome everyone to this session, and indeed a very warm welcome to Professor Sergei Karaganov. I'll just say a few words for those of you who may not be entirely familiar with Professor Karaganov's distinguished record. I'll just name just a few of his positions. He is the co-founder of Russia's Council for Foreign and Defense Policy, a club of Russian security elite, and its analytical institutions, and he now serves as its honorary chairman of its presidium. He also co-founded the Valdai Club in 2004, whose 20th anniversary we're actually celebrating this year. He's also the founder and chairman of the editorial board of the journal Russia in Global Affairs, which has, I think, gained enormous amount of weight and intellectual prestige over the last few years. He's also the scientific head of the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the National Research University High School of Economics in Moscow. And he served for many years as its dean. And I've seen Professor Karaganov at work as dean, and I was always very impressed by his work. He's also served as the deputy director of the Institute of Europe of the Soviet USSR, now Russian Academy of Sciences, since 1983. So it's a very important position. And of course, the Institute of Europe was always symbolic, its foundation and its development of a certain direction, which of course has very much changed lately. When Russia indeed enjoyed better relations with the West, Professor Karaganov was also a member of the Trilateral Commission between 1998 and 2013, and he served on the International Advisory Board of the Council on Foreign Relations. So a very distinguished and important career. More informally, Professor Karaganov is known to have been close to the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov, who remains one of the most important and distinguished and respected leaders of Russian foreign policy since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and indeed before. And he's been a presidential advisor to both Presidents Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin. Today, it is said that he enjoys close relations with President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, but maybe we'll explore that later. So we're particularly privileged to have a discussion with Professor Karaganov today, because he's one of the chief intellectual architects of Russia's current foreign policy, and part of the major change which is taking place today. He has published, along with other major figures such as Dmitry Trenin, the former head of the Moscow Carnegie Center, and IMG audiences, I think, have heard several times in webinars, Professor Tin, and author of a report, Russia's Policy Towards the World Majority, which argues, amongst other things, that the world is increasingly being divided into two by, and I quote, the desire of the US-led West to preserve its 5-century-long hegemony, which allowed it to redistribute world wealth in its favor, impose its cultural and political principles on the whole world, on the one hand, and the striving of non-Western countries towards fully fledged sovereignty, not constrained by Western dogmas, institutions, and orders on the other. So this was an important report, which is a state-of-the-art, as it were, analysis of where the world is today. And we will, in our discussion in the next hour or so, be discussing those issues. So welcome to you all, and once again, welcome to Professor Karaganov.
Thanks so much, Richard. And now I will ask Oleg to introduce Professor Richard Sakwa briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Radhika. Professor Richard Sakwa is Professor Emeritus of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent at Canterbury, and the Senior Research Fellow at the National Research University High School of Economics in Moscow. His latest books are The Putin Paradox, published in 2020, Deception, Russiagate, and the New Cold War, published in 2022, The Russia Scare, in 2022, The Lost Peace, How We Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War, published in 2023 by the Yale University Press. And Professor Sakwa is currently working on a book called The Culture of the Second Cold War. So welcome, Richard.
Great. Thanks, Oleg. And I will now introduce you. Professor Oleg Barabanov is Program Director of the Valdai Club, dealing with a program on global values and alternatives. He's also professor at Moscow State University of International Relations, the famous GIMO University, and he serves as academic director of its Eurasian Studies Institute. He has the honorary title of Professor of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and also for 10 years he served as a professor in the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics. And of course, members and followers of the International Manifesto Group will have heard him speak quite often at our seminars. And now over to you, Richard.
Yeah, so I'm now going to introduce Radhika, though I think some of you, she needs no introduction. She is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, and she works on comparative politics and political economy and international political economy. She has written or edited over a dozen books, including works on British, US, and Indian politics. And in fact, Professor Desai has just returned from India, where she's been observing close up the Indian elections. And she's also worked on Russia, including writing about Russia, Ukraine, and contemporary imperialism. In her 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, she proposed geopolitical economy as a new, more accurate way of understanding the evolution of the international relations of the capitalist world and its particular multipolar moment at this time. She has also written about the contradictions of dollar dominance and de-dollarization. So an important suite of issues, which we'll also probably touch on later today. So thank you, Radhika.
Thank you, Richard. And we are finally ready to start. So, Professor Karaganov, perhaps we thought it would be very good for us to begin with the very specific and then broaden out to more general themes. So, as you know, the special military operation of that Russia is conducting at the moment is now in its 3rd year. So the question that we wish to ask you about that is, how do you feel it has been conducted so far? How is it faring? How long do you expect it to last? What will count as victory in this? And in particular, do you think that the recent replacement of Defense Minister Shoigu with with the new defense minister, Andrei Belousov, indicates any reorientation in the conduct of that military operation. So, Professor Karaganov.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Well, Andrei Belousov is, well, I'll start with the last question. Andrei Belousov is on the start of his work. So the only thing which we know at this juncture is that he is a tremendously effective economic macroeconomist with the ethicist orientation, but very flexible and very, very clean. So one of his main tasks would be to finish the cleanup of whatever agencies there are around the military machine of Russia, and to keep it going more effectively. I don't think that he will be responsible for the conduct of the operations, to the extent I know, but of course he will be playing a very important role in the whole war effort. Well, first of all, of course, now the question is, we are fighting we call it a special war, special operation. It is a war with the West. It has been a war with the West, and now it is a war with the West. And the question of victory is the question not of victory on the fields of Ukraine. The better we win, the better it is for the Ukrainian people who are dying probably already in millions, because nobody knows, how many victims there are due to all kinds of hardships. We know more or less hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed. But the real fight is with the West, which for certain reasons decided to try the last counterattack, historic counterattack, to crush the core, the military security core of the rising global West, global majority, and that is Russia. It is also driven by all kinds of things on the Western side. As you know, on the Russian side, it is a war of survival for Russia. So the question is not the victory, but how and when. My answer to the question of how and when, I think that for a year or two, we shall try to win as much ground fighting and destroying military forces of the West, with, of course, unfortunately, which are grinding Ukrainian meat. But then sooner or later, but then very soon, we shall start to climb higher on the ladder of escalation. And I, as you know, I have been arguing for, actually, clandestinely for more than 2 years, but openly for a year, that sooner or later we have to face our Western enemies, with the fact that either we could deliver, God forbid, a nuclear strike and crush them, or else, Russia, they retreat with flying banners. There are many ways how they could do that, especially the Americans. The Europeans seem to, not all Europeans, of course, seem to run amok. But the question is about 2 years. Of course, the fight could continue, and it would for more as a low intensity conflict, and but there could be stopgaps in even negotiations or ceasefires. But it is clear that Russia needs a total victory, and it will not stop. However, there could be stopgaps.
Perhaps I may ask a quick follow-up. As you said, this is going to be quite a long, drawn-out war. Do you? One of the questions that arises is, what makes it a long, drawn-out war? Is it because as some would say, the Russians are sort of taking their own time over it, or is it because the West seems to continuously escalate, or some combination of the two?
First of all, at the beginning of the war, Russia made several miscalculations as to the readiness of Ukraine to fight, and the level of preparedness of Ukrainian forces, the underestimation of the level of support which had been offered Ukraine before the special military operation. Russia, from the beginning to the end, have been fighting a relatively low-intensity war, and that is not bombing our cities. Of course, there has been fight and a lot of destruction, but we didn't use the tactics which were used, say, in the Second World War or in Vietnam or in Iraq or else. But clearly, sooner or later, the question will come that to the fore that we have to stop it. However, I am not in a hurry because the war has brought a lot of benefits. Of course, it is sad to say that because people are dying. A lot on the Russian side, many times more on the Ukrainian side, but still people are dying. But Russia, because of its history, is a country of warriors. And so we are now living through a great renaissance of culture, of spirit, of economy, of technology, of everything. I mean, and some people even do not, for that reason, don't want to stop the war too soon. Also, the war has brought great benefits to the elite of the country. Those who are called fifth column traitors, etc., were thrown away, or run over the hill from the country without massive repressions, which is very important to take into the Russian history. Their westernizers, which were very strong and are still latently strong in the society, has been greatly undermined. The turn to the east and towards the global majority is accelerating, and they're very important. We are doing away with the help of our Western, let's call them partners this time, with the comprador class and with the comprador intellectual elite who serve this class. We created this class because of the stupid reforms of the 90s, when Russians who earn money because at the start of capitalism had only two ways to keep them. One was looking for safe haven with bandits. The second with the state, that is corruption. And the third, sending monies abroad. So we created ourselves this comprador class. But our Western and our enemies, former partners, helped us to helping us to do away with that. We invited fire on us, and it works.
Great. The next question will come from Professor Sakwa, but before we go there, I just forgot to say two things. Number one, those who are not speaking, so that's most of us, please make sure your mic is muted. And secondly, Professor Karaganov, we will have this interview for about an hour or so, and then we will have half an hour of questions and answers. And Professor Karaganov has agreed to take questions, but you will not be putting the questions directly. So we would like to request you to put your questions in the chat, and we will select some of the questions based on their relevance. We hope that should be okay.
But I am not asking for you to soften the questions. I mean,
no, not at all. Not at all. We just want to, because we are sure there'll be lots of questions. So please put them in the chat. And then we will, because of limitations of time, we will have to select some questions. So just to say.
Radhika, may I just add a second? The Russian speakers could write their questions in Russian in the chat, no problem.
Exactly. And we will be able to handle them all. So please feel free to write questions in English or Russian. Okay, Richard, please go ahead.
Yep, thanks very much. Can I pick up on one of the points which you make? You talk about total victory, and I wondered, what does a total victory look like? And in particular, we're talking about the world order, the international system, and in some of your recent writings, you've criticized the existing, what I call it, the Charter International System, the one established based on the United Nations in 1945. And of course, international politics continues in parallel to it, in this but it sets the framework of legitimacy, the norms and the laws which govern international politics today, even though, of course, more often observed in the breach than in the actual observance. But nevertheless, I just wonder whether you could define a little bit more. Yes, you talk about the world majority, you talk about Russia turning to the east, but what sort of, there's no alternative international system waiting out there. The Charter system was established after the world's worst war, the use of nuclear weapons, of course, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I just wonder, what sort of normative or even institutional framework would you envisage in a sort of a world in which Russia has this victory and in which, or the world it would like to see?
Well, first of all, Ukrainian war in Ukraine is only a small chapter, or a small piece of the tectonic shifts on the global arena, which have started approximately 15 years ago, and which are only developing and speeding up. As to of course, it is clear that the previous world order, which originates on several levels. First was, of course, the world order, which was created more or less by the West when it acquired military superiority and built on the foundation of that military superiority about 500 years ago. The whole building of its dominance, economic, cultural, political, which allowed it to get first colonial and then neo-colonial rent. By the way, Russia in many ways was a part of that process too. The second, of course, is the end of the post-war order, the better of wars, and the third is the end of the one-pole movement. So, and the fourth is probably the end of the capitalism as we know, because it has run out of its course, and it's actually clearly is starting to devastate the earth and the humanity. So there are many, underlying trends on the surface. As to the architecture, which I envision, of course, it's very hard, but it is nevertheless it's clear. Most of the institutions which we have now, I am speaking about the institutional framework, will dying, will die, will maybe will evaporate, will be dismantled, or will simply to conduct their life as dead bodies. For example, WTO, dead, long dead. Imagine our conversation 15 years ago. What would be the let's talk about the International Monetary Fund. It's not dead yet, but it's clear going in that direction. So the same as World Bank. Now, most of the agencies of the United Nations itself is, of course, is tremendously ineffective. And though we need it, of course, it is also does not play the role which envisaged by the great minds of the mid 40s, first, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, unfortunately, because of the underlying shifts, even the United Nations is less and less effective visibly. It has been losing effectiveness. What instead? Instead, I think we shall have, and we are already witnessing the growth of alternative parallel institutions, not necessarily supplanting, but adding to the existing system. Already we know that the Chinese bank connected with the with this great project gives several times more credits than the World Bank. We see we see the fantastic, though formal growth of BRICS, strengthening of CSO, Shanghai Organization. Probably we shall see a caucus of these organizations, plus Mercosur, plus Organization of African Unity, gradually building a new institutional framework. But it's too early to say because we are in biblical times. We're witnessing the birth of the new world. But at the same time, in biblical times, the Almighty had an easier job than we do have now because He was creating everything. Now we have to create something out of ruins, and we are living through the process of collapsing or eroding the previous world order. I have not mentioned the problems of changes in the morale, changes in informational revolution, etc. But I could go endlessly. But it is clear that we shall have about 20 years of the build-up of the new system. For that, now we have to avoid the Third World War, which looks highly likely every day. And I've been writing, as you know, for many, many years about the likelihood of this. But now we are virtually on the brink. But we are, of course, as we all do. In our profession, we are looking at certain points where the popular press leads us. But just have a look. Dozens of conflicts are flaring up, and sooner or later they could merge, or they are already merging. And then, of course, the question of how to stop that wave of conflict. So we have a confrontation between Russia and the West. We have semi-confrontation between the United States and China. And we have a wave of crises which will emanate almost objectively, unless we stop somehow the wave of this crisis. That is why I have started to argue openly with my colleagues that we have to reinstall the fear, put back the safety lock of nuclear deterrence into the system. It stopped to work several years ago. It saved us for about 60, 70 years during the previous period. Now we have to do something more or less like that, resurrecting nuclear deterrence. Of course, I would rather have, something nicer. A new Bretton Woods plus somewhere in New Delhi or in Mexico. But at this juncture, it's too early to say. We have to avoid the wave of crisis and the escalation of the war, uncontrollable escalation of the war in Ukraine. For that, I'm afraid it should be a controlled escalation.
We'll come back to that in a minute, but on the nuclear issue. But just to push go a bit further, did I understand that you've just said, that capitalism as we know it is coming to an end? And if that's so, obviously we're talking about a market systems, not an old communist. But still, I just wondered whether you in your own mind, you've sort of a conceptual vision. In the old days, of course, it was building socialism. And so, those ideas haven't gone away. We're not talking about Soviet-style communism, but we're talking about something. Is there a conceptual envelope in which you can put your ideas.
No, I'm not a socialist. I mean, we'll have to have a more humane, more fair, and system. It's clear that modern capitalism, or liberal imperialism, or however you call it, is running against the interest of the humanity and is running out its course. But it's not a market system, of course. Market system should be adjusted, but market system without limits, without moral limits, without political limits is a disaster. Because modern capitalism, as of course, among many other things, is built on the endless growth of the expansion of consumption, absolutely needless. That is one of the reasons, and also it has lost, of course, its moral core, which at the beginning was one of the driving forces of the industrial revolution and of pre-modern capitalism. And now this global, imperial, liberal, whatever you call capitalism, is in desperate shape, and it runs against the earth.
Well, indeed, as you say, the neoliberal form of capitalism is not just consumption, but an enormous inequality, and so not everyone is privileged to consume.
Go endlessly, you know better. By the way, I read your books, so I mean, this is about consumption, it's inequality, it's about ineffectiveness, it's about the corruption of the political systems, and of the modern democracy, which is dying, as all other previous types of democracy died. However, we could see some other type of democracy if we survive in about 30 years, or maybe younger people in our company will see that, not me. Or you. Oh, I hope you will survive for another 30 or 40 years.
Thank you.
But I mean, it is all encompassing crisis of the world system, including of course liberal imperial capitalism, or global capitalism. We see deglobalization. We have an intellectual crisis, whereas, especially in the economic field, but in many others, whereas all the notions and all theories don't work, though we pretend that they work, we still pray for the kind of chains of profit making, though the world is going more towards more economic nationalism. Obviously, we have been talking about global government, which is a fake. Remember, so though of course some of us, I remember a few years ago, my old friends from Davos wrote a book about 2 years ago, I think, again about the future brilliant world of NGOs and transnational corporations planning everything. I was very young when I saw that idea first, and I was quite enthralled by it when I met I think John Nye, Raymond Vernon, and Robert Cohen, who were the fathers of that theory. At that time, it looked great. Now it looks reactionary idiotism.
Thank you.
Can I just briefly follow up? I was also very intrigued, like Richard, to hear you say that capitalism has run its course. And I just want, and you've explained fairly well, but I wanted to press you just on a particular point. You know, most people think that capitalism is fantastic. You know, it may produce inequality, it may destroy the environment, but it is fantastic at producing things. But in reality, what we are finding out in the course of this war in Ukraine is that actually, the pace at which the Russians are able to produce war material is much faster than the West, which is actually failing to produce war material in adequate quantity and quality. So does that also bespeak a way of, capitalism having run its course? And do you think that the current aggressiveness of the capitalist, the big capitalist countries, is part of the capitalism having run its course?
In our previous life, we had, I think, a term which is called state capitalism or social capitalism. State capitalism. I think state capitalism will be, but I hope humanistic state capitalism will be the system of tomorrow. And of course, it's not only Russia. All countries with illiberal or authoritarian regimes are, and capitalist market system are doing better. Most of the countries, not every country, of course. Most of the countries are doing better, and the fight between so-called authoritarian capitalism and the liberal capitalism is basically the fight between the old dying and the new coming. But the problem is that the new are also could become imperial or have a lot of tensions between them. We have to understand the challenges of the upcoming period. And of course, we have to help our old comrades to retire with dignity. With partners, actually.
Right. Oleg, perhaps would like to put a question? Oleg, yeah.
Please excuse me. Sergei Alexandrovich, please let me start from your phrase now about the underestimation of the level of preparedness of the Ukrainians for the war. And let me put the question into a larger sphere. How do you consider, how do you feel, how is effective our foreign policy expertise to influence foreign policy decision-making? Are there expert work, recent, heard, consulted, or the practical decision-making is totally unbased on, let's say, a deep foreign policy expertise? And maybe just a follow-up, if you'd like to answer it, were you personally surprised on 24 February, just hearing the news there?
Of course, I mean, our foreign policy is lagging behind, has been lagging behind by 10 years. But there was advice and it was listened, starting from late 90s, believe me. We were writing that the fight is inevitable, that we should avoid it. I mean, a brutal, bloody fight, but they will fight. But people didn't want to face the truth, and it's not the fate of the mistake of diplomats. The society was a longing for consumption. I understand them because we have been living for 70 years undernourished in bad conditions, and people wanted just to have what we would call normal life. And so people didn't want even to think about the real world. Also, of course, we had a problem in the late communist times. I was already relatively well established in the Soviet times, and I remember how the Communist Party dogma was narrowing our research and our thinking. When the new reformers came, there were some people call them thieves. Some of them were thieves, but they were the best educated among uneducated. That was the problem. The second was, of course, that we embraced from the late 80s, witnessing the late 70s, witnessing the demise of the old communist system and the death of the communist ideology. We embraced Western liberalism, not understanding what it was. I remember, and it was impossible to tell our people. I was privileged to know the West before most of us. It was impossible to tell people that it is not the rosy picture they imagined. So we went into an abyss virtually unprepared. But their expertise has been there, but people didn't want to listen. But believe me, it was there, and it is there. As to the, I was calling openly for. Well, first of all, I said that in 1912 that the fight is inevitable. I hope that it wouldn't be as bloody as you had it. So by in 1914, 14, 15, I went on openly to say that we should harden our stance. By 18, I was calling for something very hard. Unfortunately, at that time, we were either not ready militarily or not ready morally. And then we had this COVID. So I hope that we will have. I knew that we would have a confrontation. I hope that it would happen about 2 years later, because the best was at 18. Then when the chance was lost for a while, I thought it would be a bit later, but of course it was inevitable. But people also did not want in our country and as well as elsewhere in the world, didn't want to face the truth, including the depth of the confrontation. It is a war of survival for Russia. Now, but it is also a war of survival of Western elites, most of the Western elites, not of Western countries. If West loses, these elites will be wiped away. But if Russia loses, it is wiped away. And of course, as we all know, President Putin says, who needs a world without Russia?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are you content with my answer, Oleg Nikolaevich?
Yes, thank you very much. But please let me repeat. It was a question of all three of us. Were we personally surprised on 24 February?
No. I was not. I knew that I have been telling for 25 years that there would be a war. Mm-hmm. I knew that it was coming, but also I knew that we were not prepared. So it was a very heavy blow for me exactly on that day. But then after a week, I recuperated and I started and I joined the fighting force.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Karaganov, of course, you are very famous for proposing the nuclear doctrine, to which you have already referred in your answers just now today. And we feel that we would like to ask you, on the one hand, we sort of understand what you're trying to say, but at the same time, we are also aware that it has alarmed a lot of people, not least because people feel that, you think that the West has become too adventuresome, does not sufficiently appreciate the reality of nuclear weapons. And so it's important for Russia to sort of, bring that into the foreground. But what if the West, instead of sobering up when faced with the threat of nuclear weapons, doubles down on its stubbornness? Remember also that the West, so far in the history of nuclear weapons. The United States is the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons and done so without having any serious reason for doing so, certainly serious military reason. Of course, it had serious imperialist reasons for using, it wanted to show the Soviet Union, as it was at the time, that it was in possession of these terrible weapons, precisely in order to contain the Soviet Union. So the West has already been proven its, shall we say, unreliability. So what if instead of sobering up, the West becomes even more unhinged? Instead of de-escalating, what if the West reacts by escalating? So if you might want to address that a little bit, please.
First of all, I mean, it is not only the problem of the West. People, especially in the West, but also elsewhere, got used to some kind of a peace, which we had. I mean, of course, there were wars, which we have had for 70 years. And we developed some kind of aura of strategic, what I call strategic parasitism or parasitism, whatever it is. Yeah. We started, many people started to believe that it will go endlessly like that. And people lost fear of the war, especially in the West. Also, we have seen a very rapid degeneration of the quality of elites, especially in the West. I'm sorry about, of course, I am criticizing the West. We made a lot of mistakes, and some of them saw my reports, which were which are later written by myself and others, where I'm very critical of our policies. But here we are talking about different things. How to sober up? First of all, I mean, we have started to climb the ladder escalation. I think belatedly, and I think too slowly. But the Russian nuclear doctrine, 99.9% will be changed in the coming months. The threshold will be lowered. Certain steps will be put on the agenda first, and maybe even certain military steps, short of nuclear weapons. There are many letters of that is escalation short of nuclear weapons. I mean, some which are very open. I mean, taking out drones and spy airplanes of NATO countries over international war, something like that. I mean, cutting cables. There are dozens of. Actually, I have 26 of them. Well, we could start to return to peaceful, quote unquote, or nuclear explosions, and again, hopefully not with the Tsar bomb of 50 megatons, which we blew over there, our northern territories. There are many ways. Then, of course, the time would come, and it is coming, if the West doesn't stop, when we start to attack targets in the West. Our Western partners have been bluffing, saying that if we attack, including with nuclear weapons, but I know that's a terrible moral choice, and I don't want Russia to be equal to the United States. But there are things as a nation and in survival. And second, if we do not stop this wave of conflicts, the third world war will be inevitable. It will slide into escalation. So we have two tasks. One is saving ourselves, second is saving the world. And for that, we have to make a very serious moral decisions. But hopefully, our Western partners will understand that things are getting real before it's too late for them. But it is not only about the Western world. We are on the brink of many major wars. If these wars, because of natural conflicts, are not stopped. Already tensions are in the larger Middle East, India, Pakistan, and they're all growing. And nobody we have already small wars in China, half a dozen wars in Africa. There will be other wars there, and we have to stop somehow. Plus, we already are witnessing revolution in military affairs. New technologies are coming. These drones that could make our life unpalatable if we do not stop their massive use. Just imagine, I mean, what is already happening on the fields of Ukraine that could happen out in your streets. Of course, we have also all kinds of other weapons. Biological weapons are not curtailed, and we see problems that like develop. Even genetic weapons are not under control, and weapons are being developed. On addition of all that, unfortunately, I see no other way but to frighten people so they stop before they run into the abyss.
If there is no follow-up to that, Richard, perhaps you can put the next question.
By the way, I'm sorry, Professor Desai, I would disagree on one point with you. Americans bombed, I'm a historian of nuclear strategy, bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki first of all, because they wanted to save 1 million or 2 American soldiers. And we also face the same problem. And we could win, I mean, but how many best Russian men should die for that? Or how many more, several times more, Ukrainian and other men will have to die for that? It has to be stopped. Nuclear weapons have a lot of very dangerous aspects, but nuclear deterrence has many positive aspects too.
I should say that, you know, in my defense, that I'm merely citing the position of a number of very important scholars of this particular period of history when the United States used nuclear weapons. I'm thinking particularly of Gar Alperovitz and many of his colleagues who published groundbreaking research, which in fact there were many attempts to try to stop them from publishing it. And they pointed out that the ruse that the Americans used, that they used nuclear weapons in order to prevent the loss of about 500,000 American lives in order to defeat Japan. This was complete. This was not in fact true. That Japan was already on its knees. It was suing for peace, and the United States used nuclear weapons in order to show the Soviet Union that they had these terrible weapons, so that this would somehow, you know, help contain it. But anyway, I mean, this is I mean, you know, yeah. So.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. I'm going to pick up a point just to remind people that we're not going to be taking direct questions from the audience, but so do put your points in the chat. But I also see that one of the points we were going to discuss is one that Dmitry Babich actually did put in to the chat. So I'm going to pick up on the point you made, which is about the issue of, you know, what sort of West are we talking about? I mean, in particular, it's got divisions. I mean, Russia is a European country. And, you know, what we're dealing with in particular is not, in a sense, the West in the abstraction, but with what I call the political West, that particular socio-political militaristic formation established in the First Cold War, which didn't die after the end of the First Cold War, which then radicalized and then has become more and more, in your terms, more dangerous. But of course, within the West, there's many counter forces. There's, I mean, the mere fact that we, that's Radhika and I, living in the West, are having this discussion is perhaps a very small, but I think not unimportant, and Alan, indication of it, is that there is you know, the peace movement today in the West is very weak, but nevertheless, you know, we're talking about a very specific, so we need to identify what we're targeting. On the one side, this particular militaristic political West, and of course its socioeconomic, the vulture capitalism associated with it, as excellent book by Grace Blakely just finished it. So I mean, we're talking about, you know, how can we make I mean, it has always been Russia's eternal vision that it was a better representation of Europe, the better West. How do we achieve that better West, which is then, if you could say, immanent in the West? Unfortunately, it's been much overlain by this logic of war and militarism and vulture neo-colonial capitalism, etc., etc. So can we save the West? Can it not by, you know, certainly making it more sober, but maybe using forces within the West, alliances, and indeed a very positive vision of a developmental and peace project, which, okay, we're not going to use the word socialism, but let's use the word, you know, sovereign internationalism, a vision based on the United Nations, a vision based on the end of the Second World War in 1945, that vision, that spirit of the meeting of Soviet and US forces on the Elbe in April, just exactly anniversary we've just celebrated. So, you know, how will the West develop? And Russia's European identity, how can it be reaffirmed in the future?
There are several questions which I have to answer simultaneously. I will try to start with the last, Russian European identity. You know what? I was one of the intellectual fathers of our Russian turn to the East. And I'm happy that it is accelerating. And with that, I must say, I'm very happy that we have finished the 300 years of our journey to the West, to the Europe. We actually had an extra century. We should have stopped a century ago. I mean, that would have been great for us. We got a lot from our voyage, our European voyage, the greatest literature in the world, great music, a lot of other cultural and other experiences. But basically, we're not European. Now, we were born by, of course, from Byzantium, and we were born, and the core of our statehood, I mean, which is in our genes, is of course the empire of Genghis Khan. So we're turning back. Recently, by the way, I have found out that Alexander Nevsky, who is one of the most respected figures in Russian history, who fought German invaders with the help of Mongols, actually traveled to Karakorum. He was the first Russian Siberian, and probably there he met Khan Kubilai, who became the founder of the Ming dynasty, who was at that time at Karakorum. So we have very, very deep Asian roots, very deep roots in the South. So we are returning back home now, and I'm quite happy with that. Actually, 30 or 40 years ago, when I was one of those who wanted us to come closer to Europe, come back to Europe, because we were cut partially from Europe, which we imagined, the humane, wealthy, full of art, full of brilliant scholars, and like you, and full of brilliant ideas. Now there is not very much what we could get by returning back. The West has changed. I don't want to go into a long list of problems you have had, but I think that one of the good things of this crisis is that the Western elites, which are afraid of Russian healthy influence, are cutting the West from us. and the Western disease is not spreading to us, and the Western disease. I mean, of course, these new values, which are anti-European, I would say anti-humane. I don't want to go into that direction more. So the trip is finished. 20, 30 years from now, we will have good relations, hopefully to survive with many European countries, or whatever there will be, restoration of many links. But it would be a different relationship, absolutely. And hopefully by that time, Europe will overcome its present moral crisis too, which it is not the last and first and the last one in history. We remember the late Roman Empire. But so I hope Europe will resurrect and the West will resurrect itself in a different form. As to whether we should count on elites, no. I mean, people in the West have to decide themselves what they want. Thank you, no interference. Let the West, I mean, rot in their juices. I know that it's very sounds very unpleasant, and I know that you do not deserve that. There are many, actually, most of the people in the West who are now forbidden to travel to us, who are very decent and who still are, as we call old Europeans. I think Russia is becoming one of the most European countries, but with very deep Asian roots. We're turning home.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, my history of my mother is from a very important Jewish family. My father is Slavic Russian with the name of Black Ham, so I'm Russian.
Right. Thank you. Oleg, would you like to put the next question?
Yeah, Sergei Alexandrovich, you maybe know that the International Manifesto Group is mainly the group of Marxist intellectuals. And I already see in our chat the questions, how contemporary Russia could react to socialist ideas. There were questions by Marta Schmidt, by Nora Fernandez. And you know that our highest leadership, let me put it in that way, is quite openly anti-communist, anti-Leninist. But among very few friends that we have in the West now, they are exactly left intellectuals. So what can we do, both experts and politicians in Russia, to make the contemporary anti-communist, anti-Leninist Russia attractive to the international left? Thank you.
Oh, first of all, I mean, it is not, I'm sorry, Oleg Nikolaevich, I don't want Russia to be attractive. I mean, I want Russia to develop its own way, become richer, freer, I mean, flamboyant, everything. So we don't need any nods from outside, be that from China or from Europe. However, we made many mistakes in our history, including in our recent history. One was, of course, that we threw away the baby with the water. That is, we threw away Marxism. The Lenin theory of imperialism is the best, theory which could explain the contemporary world. But because of by the way, I'm a natural anti-communist for a very simple reason, because I know that this is what communism or what system brought to us. You know that I was one of the founders of this movement of remembrance of victims of repressions. But so I don't want communism to return to Russia. But we need to bring back into our intellectual life Marxism. It was very strange. We are accusing West of abolishing history, while we abolished and abolishing their own intellectual and political history, but we abolished some of our history and some of our intellectual history, which is stupid. It's a mistake. But I'm not calling for communism back. Thank you. We have had that more than enough. And we nearly collapsed totally. I mean, and I was very active, as you know, in politics in the 1990s, and I was very desperately trying to save our country among many others. And when finally, at the end of the 1990s, when we were dead completely, all of a sudden, Putin came. I'm not praising him. Something happened. I said, and we started to resurrect ourselves. I said that God forgave Russia for the sin of communism, but not of Marxism.
I guess if there's no follow-up to that very interesting answer, I will ask another question, which is directly connected with your answer, Dr. Karaganov. The question we had is, can you give us an account of how your views evolved? You were very prominent also in the Soviet times, and then, you were an intellectual, you remained an important intellectual in post-communist Russia. So how has your view evolved, both of the world order and Russia's place in it, but also, about things like communism, Marxism, socialism, capitalism, etc., about the domestic order within your country, what it should be and why you make those choices?
Well, I shared many of the illusions of my generation. Maybe I have less than I was better educated and had an experience of meeting with many leading figures in the West, or even living in the West in the 70s, I mentioned, which is absolutely unbelievable, as not as an official, by the way. So I knew something better, but of course, I believe that we should return to what I would call Europe, to Europe of enlightenment, to Europe of political and economic freedoms, to Europe of Hugo, Beethoven, de Gaulle, Adenauer, and Brandt. And I worked towards that for quite a while. The first blow was 1994, when I learned that the decision had been made to expand NATO. Before that, I persuaded President Yeltsin to apply for NATO membership, so that NATO would change its nature. We were rejected. Then there was this decision. That was the first blow to my personal intellectual position. The final blow was made in 1999, when during the days of the rape of former Yugoslavia. After that, I said, no way. And actually, many even of the liberal elites at that time, they understood. They started to understand that. And in the late 90s, when they understood from 1996, 1987, that we are getting into confrontation because the NATO and other institutional expansion of the West is inevitable. I was telling my friends at the council, smile, because they will deliver coup de grace. So we smiled for a while. And then Putin came. By the way, he was, I think, sincerely trying again to build up an entente cordiale. But after a year or two, and actually I was very skeptical about that, but I hoped that he would have succeeded. He didn't. And after a year or two, by 2 or 3, the game was finished. After this war in Iraq, a war withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, and so some other gestures, we went on the inevitable road of confrontation. I hoped that it wouldn't be as bloody as it is, but you know that it was exactly during these years, two or three. Now we know that President Putin ordered, in spite of the fact that the country was desperately poor still, resurrection of our strategic nuclear programs, which now give us even some kind of a quote-unquote preponderance in strategic nuclear matters. But I still hope that the West would understand. I still couldn't understand why the West, or whomever you call the West, run so desperately into this abyss. Well, I could have my explanations, which we now are in a seminar about Russian foreign policy, not about the Western foreign policy. So I don't want to go deep into that. But actually, I was disappointed, but long before most of my compatriots. But we worked hard to resurrect Russia. First military might, then political might, now spiritual might. So
Indeed.
we are on the way out.
Quick follow-up, because President Putin is known to have said that the disintegration of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical disaster. But at the same time, I'm sure he would agree with you that you cannot bring back communism. This would not work. This would be a disaster, etc. So can you sort of say something about the apparent contradiction of that? I mean, how do you rate the role of the Soviet Union in history, and what does that role mean for Russia today, essentially? And yes, and together with that, I mean, and I don't know whether you would agree with this, but many would argue that the West has always been hostile towards Russia. It's not something new. It's almost sort of, goes back several hundred years at least. So can you reflect on that as well? And I should say, before I finish, that we've been going an hour and 15 minutes. So maybe we will all start with the last set of questions and incorporate as many of the questions we've had in the chat as well. So in the last round, but please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, first of all, I mean, Russophobia has been there for many centuries, so it's just a fact of life, doesn't it? Soviet Union made a huge breakthrough in human affairs because it opened up new horizons, but it paid too dearly for these new horizons for the humanity. Actually, the fact that Soviet Union, Soviet socialism, brought total education for the society, equality, brought fantastic growth of industry and science, and it created a challenge which humanized capitalism. When Soviet Union collapsed because of its own mistakes or because it was worn out, we saw what happened with capitalism. It dehumanized, and we have this capitalism, which is now we have without the challenge of Soviet communism. But I don't want to return Soviet communism because we paid too dearly for that. We nearly survived the awful 20th century, but it was also the era of massive repressions of I would say, genocide of peasants in Russia, not in Ukraine. I mean, by the way, also the Union, mostly in Russia and Kazakhstan, because they were pushed away, done away with as as a competitive class, which could have challenged the rule of the Communist Party. But on top of that, we won a war which could not have been won, and which brought us a fantastic literature during the war and fantastic music, which we had a great resurrection of spirit during the mid-Soviet times. It gradually went down since 70s, but still these were I'm proud of many of the things the Soviet Union, my country did. But I am very bitter about the price. And as I've said, I spent 10 years of trying to build up a system of remembrance of the victims of repression. And I'm proud to be one of the authors of the idea of building a huge monument to the victims of the repression in the center of Moscow, 30 meters wall.
Thank you. Yeah. Richard, please.
Thank you. One of the issues we were going to discuss is Russia's relations with China and India. And this builds on a couple of points in the chat. Joseph Clark asks, how do we build a liberation world order, an order not subject to the will of hegemons, and one that is democratically based and empowered? And following on from that, Samuel Ramani asks about the development of a multipolar world order. And obviously core to that would be the development of relations with China and India. And so to what degree, going back to Yevgeny Primakov's idea of the mid-1990s, the Russia-India-China idea, of course, which is the core of BRICS as it developed, which you've mentioned earlier. But of course, India and China have divergent views, and of course, whole question of developments in Asia Pacific. So I wonder whether you could give us your thoughts on that. Obviously, President Putin has just visited Xi Jinping. They've had the second joint declaration, an amazing declaration in all sorts of ways, building on the one of February 2022. So thank you.
The triangle is, of course, one of the strongest foundation of the future world order, but it is not the foundation. I think the foundation will be after this period of instability, of adjustment, even of conflicts, which will last 2 decades approximately, hopefully not more. We will have a balanced world order with new institutional framework. There will be no hegemon for obvious reasons, because China could not be a hegemonic power for many reasons. One of the reasons is that now it will be surrounded by huge powers with whom it will have to live. Until the 15th century, China in its world was not a very peaceful country, by the way. It was fighting and subduing its neighbors until it created some kind of a milieu of vassal states around it. And then they decided that they have reached the paradise, stopped warring, told themselves that a good man wouldn't become a soldier, and started to enjoy life. And after that, they paid for that a dear price. But now I am not afraid of Chinese imperialism, resurrection, or whatever it is, because China will be balanced. And also, it is not an expressionist power because of its own philosophy, as we all know. So there will be a balance of powers in the Eurasia. United States, a tip of some countries connected closer to the United States on their western pinnacle of the European peninsula. Most of the countries of Europe, many of the countries in Europe, especially of the southern tier and Central Europe, will become a part of what we call Greater Eurasia. And Greater Eurasia is a term of building up the institutional, intellectual, and cultural framework for the New World Order, which will include some Europe, most Europe, Middle East, and most of Asia. Russia would be the balance of that order if we survive well. And actually, it will be a fantastic world for Russia because we are one of the most culturally open civilizations in the world. We call ourselves finally the country civilization. We are better. We are civilization of civilizations. And we're absolutely open to our Asian friends, to our African friends. I mean, of course, there are racists, chauvinists here as well as everywhere else, but it's not by chance that communist internationalism became so popular in Russia, because we are internationalists. And this world order is born for us, which will hopefully come out of this order of the coming decades. And we will have at first, say, hopefully, maybe a caucus of institutions. Maybe then they will supplant United Nations or change United Nations. The United Nations is a useful institution. The problem with the United Nations is, of course, that there are many problems. Of course, the rivalry between the great powers is the one, but the problem is that the Secretariat of the United Nations is totally pro-Western, for obvious reasons, and it could not be reformed if you add 2 or 3 countries to their security, to the permanent membership of the Security Council. So, but we should keep United Nations building a parallel set of institutions, hopefully merging eventually with the United Nations, or in a bit of different architecture. European security order hopefully will be dead. There will be no European security order. And I'm very happy that leaders of my country are stopped talking about European security architecture or European security order for 2 years, and are starting to talk about what it should be, Eurasian security, new Eurasian security order. United States hopefully would survive and return to its normal place of a great country over the oceans, of course, with a lot of involvement, because it has built up a strong involvement, but it could not afford an empire under circumstances when the foundation of the empire, that its military superiority and the ability to impose its will by force, is dead on arrival. It's finished. And of course, there's a desperate fight in Ukraine, but I don't think they could win. Hopefully, in their last rearguard battle, they will not take down the humanity with them. That's why I'm saying that we should arrange a dignified retreat with flying banners. And I'm calling on the whatever you call on American elite, hidden American elite, deep state, to change some of their leaders who are totally irresponsible and start to cut losses. But of course, it will be, the situation in the United States is complex, so we have to have that problem also for at least 10-15 years until they find a new balance. But the United States probably will survive. Well,
yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, I mean, fascinating you talk about a Eurasian security order, which is obviously going to be post-Atlantic, and this Atlanticism, which has dominated for 75 years, to say to the United States, thank you very much, but time to go home. But that takes up one of the points in the chat from Jorge Cachinero, who argues that it isn't only the left-leaning intellectuals in the West who are sympathetic to to this sort of new vision of world order you're talking about. But obviously, we're talking about a whole stack of conservative internationalists in the United States. I won't name them, but I'm sure you know some of them. And of course, in Europe, we have certain countries, of course, Slovakia, Hungary are in the van in the leading this way, who see, maybe not alliance with Russia, but see a commonality of purpose of a different type of order based more on development, a vision of peace, which is post-Atlantic. So I wonder, as I say, following up from what you're saying, so European security order cannot be seen in isolation.
There are many layers in this crisis, or whatever crisis. Crisis is also time of creation, so it's not negative. Europe will have to go through, probably most of Europe will go through a bout of fascism. That is clear. That is obvious, so no question about that. Hopefully, not Nazism. Also, it will not be allowed, because Nazis will not be allowed in Europe anymore, because Russia is here. Now, but fascism will grow. New left will be growing, but also new right, nationalist right, as a reaction to inequality, as a reaction to all unsolved problems. You know the situation better. So Europe will have to also to adjust. Many countries in Europe are already adjusting. I mean, you named some to this new order. The leader of modern Eurasianism is Hungary. They are, I mean, the intellectual leaders of Eurasianism. I mean, they're actually competing with us and others intellectually. So it's very funny, but very pleasant. It's a very good competition. But we shall see. But Europe, for the time being, we're living from one crisis into another, doing away with hopefully doing away with this new wave of anti-values. I call them anti-human. But for that, they will have to live through a reaction of both on the left and the right. This time, I hope, because of nuclear weapons, there will be no Hitler anymore, or Nazis. But what you have already there, if you watch carefully, is very much resembles in many countries, at least in Mussolini. We, of course, I don't want to go for really hardcore propaganda, but the regime, whatever you call this regime in Kiev, is very ugly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Oleg, would you like to?
Yes, and I also try to put together some questions from our chat. Sergei Alexandrovich, we have a real debate on history in our chat. First, there are points of view that Russia is still a European country and has a European history. That was the point of Dmitry Babich. That was the point of Ekaterina Sjöstrand, who said that our first ruling dynasty of Rurikovich was of Scandinavian origin. Stana Dubaic points that in Russia, some mistakes tend to repeat every 200 years. And Yuris Motor poses a question, to whom in Russian history, to which Tsar or Emperor or anybody else, Vladimir Putin is similar more. But and many other questions and many other debates, who is the worst traitor, Gorbachev or Yeltsin? It's a really sharp debate now. Developing, but let me put it all together. because we all see how important is history for Vladimir Putin's policy personally. He often uses it. And it's sure that history could teach lessons, that history could unite and consolidate the nations. But if we have too much historical lectures instead of a dialogue on real political, economical questions with the nation, I see that at least some of our students are becoming more and more irritated with these historical lectures, with this historical example. So what do you think about role of history in the current Russian policy? Thank you.
As to our students, I mean, my advice to them, and relax and take it easy. You will adjust first, and also learn, and not reject. Also, a person or a country without a history is not a country. And the person without history is not a person. And that is very much a part of the debate. Russia is resurrecting its identity, building a new identity. And of course, it's getting back to its roots. We are not rejecting our European origins, but mostly because some of them come from Byzantium. Of course, Nordic princes played a role, but they didn't play a significant cultural role in Russia. But the Asian influence on Russian political mentality is much stronger. But we're not rejecting our European roots altogether. Actually, I must say that we have to do special effort to replenish them. One of the slogans of people like myself is that we are the true Europeans, and Eurasians too, first of all. Second, without understanding history, you couldn't understand yourself. People who reject history reject themselves. Of course, we could make mistakes, and history could be, and has always been, an instrument of policy making. But if you understand yourself better, you make fewer mistakes. So one of the great things which I love in my country is that we are gradually taking at face value everything in our history, all our mistakes, all our gorgeous achievements, all our tragedies. So Ivan the Terrible is becoming one of the greatest rulers, but also Alexander II, the reformer, is also one of the greatest rulers. If I do not know, of course, and I never talked about that issue with Putin, I'm not close to him at all. But I think his favorite ruler is Alexander III. My favorite ruler too. Actually, he made the real turn to the east. He started the return because it was during his rule where Vita and then later joined by Stalin started to build their famous railroad, which was, an unbelievable achievement, and which now brings Russia to the future, because without our Asian holdings of we wouldn't have been one Eastern European countries like Poland. It's a sad joke, but now we are a great empire in the better sense of the word, and we will be growing mostly towards the east. And the next step will be, of course, new development of Siberia, of Central Siberia, project which I call Siberization of Russia, and returning home. But, of course, we shall not give away Beethoven, Nietzsche, Goethe, or Leonardo da Vinci. They are ours, even if they're rejected for their alleged sins by some in modern Europe.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make sure, Oleg, did you ask all the, are there questions from the Russian chat that you feel you would like to put? Well, let me also explain that I have one more question to put, but maybe it should be the final question. So if Richard or Oleg would like to put any questions first, please go ahead from the chat or from their own thinking, and then I will put the last one.
I think that film, I'm just looking at the chat, and I must say, as Oleg has noted, it's a fantastic discussion, first about Russian history, and second about who are Russia's friends, including a comrade from Cuba, and of course references to Africa and globally. So yes, Russia is finding a new path today. But who are its friends? And it does have friends. We're talking about, we've got European parliamentary elections next week, of course. Well, not us in England, because we're no longer part of it, but it is taking place, and it's a shift to the right. In other words, as Xi Jinping said when he visited Putin earlier, we're seeing changes the like of which we've not seen in 100 years. You've also alluded to it, changing over from 500 years. So, this final point, that the world is changing. Russia does have allies, political, also in states, and how to build on this alliance. And again, to come to our first point, and also one of the things in the chat is this, coming back to this question of socialism, not communism. You've played a very important part in the de-Stalinization and the historical memory of Russia over the last 30 years. As you said, you called for a monument to Stalin's victims in Moscow, and there's their wall of memory today. So there's all of that. But we're talking about, we're looking to the future. A democratic socialism which can constrain the crazy excesses of capitalism and also can limit this militarism, which of course threatens Russia, but not only, the rest of the world as well, and of course our own well-being in the West. So it's a lot of things in there, but just thought your thoughts and comments on that.
For the time being, my favorite concept for Russia is fortress Russia. That is, defended, inward-looking, developing, spiritually, economically, politically inside, open to friends, but strong and with its enemies, and closed to bad winds from the West. Eventually, after, say, 20 years, I hope that, as I've said, Russia would be one of the leading countries of the new Eurasian order. And actually, the Eurasian, Northern Eurasia, the balance, cultural, political, economic. Also, it will be, of course, the supplier of foods to the world, as well as many other necessary material for development of humanity, because we are enormously rich in terms of water, in terms of clean air, in terms of space. So hope as to the political system, it will be authoritarian social capitalism. What it will look like. Yeah. Well, actually, I would even love, I would have loved a monarchy, but with only one in Russia, but with one proviso, that the monarch will be me. I wouldn't trust any other monarch in Russia.
Very good.
Well, on that slightly provocative note, I will put the final question, which actually goes back to the question that Richard had put first when one of his first questions, and also it rhymes. It's very close to many of the questions that have been put in the chat, which is that what are the principles that you feel should define the new world order that Russia is trying to achieve. And I guess I'd also like to throw in, many people say, oh, the United Nations has become useless, etc. But if you think about the original principles of the United Nations, they were very good principles of equal sovereignty, non-interference, non-aggression, all those things. And indeed, some years ago, there was a group created, of which Russia is, I believe, a member, called Group of Friends of the Charter of the United Nations. So, bearing that in mind, what would you say should be the defining principles of the New World Order in which Russia can prosper, but so can other countries?
Well, first of all, of course, UN Charter is a brilliant piece of political intellectual work. I would be happy if it would be the foundation of the future world order. But of course, we'll have to adjust because the UN Charter was built under different circumstances when global problems, not in terms of globalism, capital globalism, blah, blah, but global problems are much more acute and they're very, very, very different. But the ideal world would be the world with a multiplicity of nations, of cultures, of political styles, respect for everybody. And hopefully peace. But to achieve that, we'll have to live through a very turbulent period and survive. And we have to fight for peace because now we are in a situation worse than in 1914 and even worse than in 1939 because of the multiplicity of crises. At that time, there was only one, more or less. Of course, there was a rivalry between Soviet Union and Britain and blah, blah, blah. All these rivalries in Europe at that time. But now the things are much more complicated than that. So I would say it's worse than 39. Of course, it is better that we still have nuclear weapons. And we still, for one, it is one of the reasons why we do not have Hitler as of yet. Because nuclear weapons have one very significant influence on the humanity. It is civilizing elites. That's why I return to the issue of resurrecting the nuclear reserves. If I don't want to be so kind, it's fear of God and fear of death. Because as I write, and I sincerely believe in that, knowing the history of nuclear weapons, that it is the weapon of God, which he bestowed us when we Europeans, meaning us two Russians, so it's allowed for 2 world wars in one generation. So we have to, he saved us for a while, but we have to help him, even if you don't believe in him.
Quite right. If there are no other questions from Richard or Oleg, then perhaps we've been going for nearly 2 hours, so we can bring this to a close. So I just wanted to say that the discussion ended on a very profound note, of course. But the entire discussion was really fascinating. I think we have learned a lot from you and also about the evolution of your thinking, which is a great treat. And so thank you very much from me and from my co-interviewers. I hope very much that we will have you back at some other point, perhaps on another important turning point of the evolution of the world order or something. And so, yeah, with that, thank you very much from the International Manifesto Group, from the Radhika,
Yes.
and from the Orinoco Tribune. Sorry, please go ahead.
By the way, we have one problem which I haven't mentioned, that we are cut from each other artificially. But be my guests in Moscow. We are absolutely open.
Thank you. Yes. Well, perhaps we will see each other in Moscow before too long. And I hope that the day comes when you will be able to come to places like London or New York as well. So hopefully that's the world we are trying to work towards.
I am sanctioned. I have full levels of sanctions. I am proud, even when I got all sanctions possible. I learned about a resolution of the of European Parliament calling for imposing sanctions on myself and two others. I don't remember, and the Patriarch. We had been all sanctions before, but European Parliament sanctioned us for the fourth time. That was such a pleasure.
Yes, I guess.
Hopefully we come to senses after all.
Yes, indeed. I hope very much. Also, I must remember to thank Anastasia for her excellent interpretation, which Alan tells me has been perfect. So we will have this video. If those of you who are here, please feel free to share. We will put this on the International Manifesto Group website and presumably on the Valdai and the Orinoco Tribune websites as well, in Russian and English. So please share widely. It's been a really fascinating interview. And thanks again to all for coming. Thanks to Professor Karaganov. Thanks to my co-interviewers.
Great pleasure also to see many familiar places and some unfamiliar. Hopefully we'll become familiar again.
Thank you.
And maybe just a word, let me thank you, the International Manifesto Group from the Valdai Club, as the co-organizer, as the main co-organizer of these events. The Valdai is open to all our audience. Please follow our website, valdaiclub.com, both in English and Russian, and feel free to write us your ideas, your texts. You are very welcome. Thank you.
Great. And please also visit our other sponsors' website, which is the Orinoco Tribune, based in Venezuela. So please check that out as well. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone. And goodbye and good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.